Thank you for joining the Reentry special seminar. My name is Yasuhiko Yoshida. I'm Vice Chair of Reentry. I'm serving as the moderator for this seminar. Today, we are truly honored to welcome Ms. Wendy Cutler, Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute, and Mr. Clete Willems, partner of Aiken. I would like to thank both speakers for joining this seminar from Washington, where it is late night. Many of you know Ms. Cutler as a former diplomat and negotiator in the office of USTR, including chief negotiator for Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, under Obama administration, and Mr. Willems as a former deputy assistant to the president and former deputy director of NEC under Trump administration. I have a fond memory of cooperating with him for the APEC summit in 2017, and I'm grateful for his coordination to make this seminar happen. Please refer to the bio in the event invitation for further information. At this seminar, Ms. Cutler and Mr. Willems will deliver a lecture based on the report titled Reimagining the TPP, Revisions that Could Facilitate U.S. Reentry. This report can be downloaded at the Asia Society Policy Institute website. Japanese government has been urging the U.S. to return to the TPP from the strategic perspectives. As it is such an important topic, I'm excited to listen to their presentation. After the 45 minutes presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers until 11 a.m. Tokyo time. Now, Ms. Cutler and Mr. Willems, please start your presentation. Thank you.
Well, good morning to all my friends and colleagues in Tokyo. It's really my pleasure to join this webinar. And Yoshida-san, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I recall Reentry being such a strong partner of the United States during the TPP negotiations. And so it's a great place to come back and to present the paper that Clete Willems and I spent a lot of time putting together. Next slide. What I wanted to start with is that when we left TPP in 2017, this was on the third day of President Trump's tenure in office, I think it came as a surprise to many. But looking back on those years, there was increasing disappointment in the United States growing and skepticism about international trade in general that was building. And that dissatisfaction, I think, culminated during the presidential campaign of 2016. So when we left TPP, perhaps there was a consensus in the United States that that was a smart move at that time. I didn't agree with it, but we'll put that aside. But since 2017, many things have changed, which in the minds of Clete and me suggests that it's really time for the United States to take a fresh look at the TPP and really try and restart and reshape a discussion about the merits of rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, we're very aware that Japan has been urging the United States at very senior levels to rejoin since 2017. And to be clear, my view is this is not going to happen in the immediate term, but if it is going to happen, we need to have a conversation in the United States about CPTPP and to reshape the discussion into not whether we should rejoin the CPTPP or whether we should not join, but more, what would it take the United States to rejoin CPTPP? And in this spirit, both Mr. Willems and I spent a great deal of time having extensive domestic consultations as well as consultations with certain CPTP partners, including Japan, about substantive changes that possibly could be made to the CPTPP to really pave the way for re-entry of the United States at some point in time. So what has changed since 2017? And I think the bullets on the slide are probably known very well by the audience, including that under the strong and unexpected leadership of Japan, the 11 other CPTPP signatories rallied together to put the agreement into effect even without the United States. In addition, China and 14 other countries in the region concluded RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which went into effect a year ago, January, and just last week, the Philippines, the 14th member of RCEP, ratified the agreement. The United States also negotiated and passed what we call the NAFTA 2.0, the United States MCA Mexico-Canada Agreement, which received really unprecedented strong bipartisan support from Congress, which in my view demonstrates that if it's the right agreement, we can get congressional approval. Furthermore, China now has started, or at least expressed its interest in joining CPTPP. And my understanding now is the UK is on the verge of acceding to the TPP, with negotiators working very hard as we speak right now. Bipartisan concern about China has intensified in Congress, and Clete will talk more to that, including recent deliberations of the new China Select Committee on China. And finally, with now the House majority going to the Republicans, Republican members are, many Republican members and key Republican members are looking into how to restart and to kind of step up our trade engagement and overall economic engagement in the region. And finally, I would just say that kind of the issues that we worked on hard in the lead up to the 2015 conclusion of the TPP, some of those issues need updating, like digital. We'll get more into this. But issues like supply chains and digital trade have become just more and more important. And with that, why don't we go to the next slide, and I'll turn to Mr. Willems.
Thanks so much, Wendy, and thanks everyone for listening in this morning. It is really great to be with you. I will personally say that I have always enjoyed working with the government of Japan, working with Japanese businesses. You are such a crucial ally of the United States. And, I really hope that we can make progress on this initiative and find ways to bring our countries closer together. Wendy did a really good job of highlighting why we're doing this and why we're doing it now, why we think the timing is right. But let me just emphasize a couple quick points before I talk more in depth about the political dynamic. I think first, the thing to realize is the conversation in the United States so far has not been particularly productive about TPP. You have some people in Washington who say we should just join TPP as it exists. And I know that that's something that Japan might like to see. But the reality is that as negotiated, the perspective in the United States is that the agreement does not fully meet our objectives. And as Wendy noted, there is a belief that it's in need of modernization. It doesn't go as far as USMCA does in certain areas. And so, unfortunately, I think it is unrealistic to simply rejoin TPP as it is. At the same time, I think it's very unsatisfactory to say that we'll never rejoin TPP, that we should just walk away from this agreement. And I really think this is where the issue of China comes into play. And the reality is that China is negotiating trade agreements in the region. They have the RCEP agreement. They're trying to exceed the CPTPP. And there's a recognition that the United States needs to have a viable economic alternative. And that in the absence of such an alternative, it's going to be very challenging for us to achieve some of our supply chain goals and our goals about both strengthening supply chains with our friends and allies, as well as trying to diversify supply chains away from China. And so there really has become this imperative for the United States to do something. Now that brings me to the political dynamic. And as you'll see on this slide, there are champions in Congress who really understand this. And we put a few up here, Tom Carper and John Cornyn, who are influential members of the Senate Finance Committee, have really been pressing for the United States to re-engage on TPP, and really this recognition that our supply chain goals and our ability to work closely with our partners and allies and our ability to provide a counterweight to China depend upon that kind of approach. Darren LaHood and Carol Miller in the House are two members who are looking at introducing legislation that would talk about bringing the United States back to TPP. We've been working very closely with their offices on that legislation to try to help gain support. And then I would really look at the Select Committee on China. The Select Committee is a new committee that was started only about a month ago. It was an initiative from the Republicans in Congress to really try to focus on the challenge that China poses to the market economies, to democracies. And among other things, there's a lot of interest in that committee in trying to figure out, is there a way to better work with U.S. partners and allies to counter China? And the committee is going to be very focused on defensive measures and looking at things like export controls and investment screening in ways to reduce our relationship with China. But I think at the same time, there's a recognition that we need to look at increasing our relationship with others that are in the Indo-Pacific and can help provide a counterweight to China. And so I am optimistic that working with that committee, we can really make progress on getting more support for TPP. And in fact, this committee had its first hearing last night, and one of the Democratic members of the committee asked General McMaster, who was my old boss in the White House, about the importance of re-engaging in trade in the Indo-Pacific, and that was something that he endorsed. Now, at the same time, we have to recognize that there are going to be strong opponents to this path. And we are trying in the paper that we produced to address some of the concerns that they've raised about TPP. But given the strong opposition to trade agreements more generally among U.S. unions, among some of the more progressive members, it is likely that they will remain opposed to this. So we just have to find a way to mitigate some of that opposition and really build champions where we can. And the goal here, like Wendy has said, is really just to start this conversation about what's possible, to lay the political groundwork so that we can do something like this, possibly in 2025, either in President Biden's second term or when you have a new Republican president. Now, I mentioned here at the end, really the members of Congress to watch to see if we can get signals that we're really moving the conversation in the right direction. Jason Smith is the brand new chairman of Ways and Means. He is someone who has been critical of the Biden administration for not including market access in IPEF, who has talked about the need for market access trade agreements to counter China, but has not yet taken a position on TPP. He is someone who's also close with the Trump administration, and so does have some of that skepticism about TPP. And so that's the kind of person that we need to convert to our side if we're really going to get this done. And then finally, I point to Mike Gallagher and Raja Krishnamurti, who are the lead members of Congress on the China Committee, and who we are hoping to try to get endorse this kind of approach. Let's go to the next slide, please.
Thank you. And on this slide, we wanted just to at least touch upon the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is the Biden administration's economic engagement plan for the Indo-Pacific. initiative that is way underway right now. And we are grateful for Japan's strong support of this initiative. While there are some similarities and some overlaps between CPTPP and IPEF, there are really important differences. And Ambassador Tai has made it very clear that IPEF is not a traditional trade agreement. Unlike traditional trade agreements that include market access provisions, including cutting tariffs and dealing with quotas and services commitments, IPEF will not have and does not have market access commitments. It also will not include a dispute settlement mechanism, which is a feature of the CPTPP. And the membership is different as well. And if my numbers are correct, 7 CPTPP members are IPEF members, which leaves half of the IPEF members are not part of CPTPP. But there is some important overlap. And with respect to the content, while certain areas of CPTPP will be covered in IPEF, most notably in the trade pillar, which USTR is leading, there are 3 other pillars led by the Commerce Department dealing with supply chains, clean energy, anti-corruption, and tax, which for the most part are not handled in CPTPP, although there are some provisions with respect to anti-corruption and some trade facilitation procedures, which I would argue overlap with some supply chain commitments as well. Now, one point we just want to make here, we don't view these two as initiatives as mutually exclusive. So in other words, if we're doing IPEF, doesn't mean we couldn't do CPTPP or vice versa. There's another way to look at this, and that is that if we successfully complete IPEF, particularly if we can do so this year, then that really lays the groundwork for a next step. And what more can the United States do to step up its economic engagement? Or can IPEF serve kind of as a building block to CPTPP? And I think all of us will need to be creative here, because I do think that, at least in the medium term, there is a pathway from one to the other. Next slide, and back to Clete.
Thanks, Wendy. And I agree with that last point in particular, which is IPEF in some ways is helpful politically to make the case that we need to do CPTPP, because one can point to IPEF and say that in some ways it falls short of CPTPP, and therefore we need to do more. And that is something that, especially on the Republican side, is an effective talking point and an effective argument for CPTPP. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we want IPEF to fail. In fact, what we want is for IPEF to succeed, and then for IPEF to be a stepping stone to pave the way, to make it easier for us then to broaden out to CPTPP. Now, what I want to talk about now is just briefly the process here and the background on how we produced this report. I think Wendy and I have explained why we think it's necessary and why we think the timing is right in the United States. So this gets more into the logistics of what we've actually tried to accomplish here. And what we did is we put together a group of 10 experts, and we have agreed not to reveal their names because we wanted them to be able to speak very freely. We included experts that are well-known figures in the national security area, well-known figures with the labor community, people who served in the Obama administration, and others, in addition to myself, who were in prominent roles in the Trump administration. And we wanted all of these people to be able to speak freely to us in this process. And so we agreed that Wendy and I would be the only ones to come out publicly with respect to this report, but we benefited from all of their input. And this group of 10, we got together and we tried to figure out what were the objectives of what we were trying to do. And I think it's very easy to make some of the national security arguments, to make the geostrategic arguments about how the United States is going to provide a counterweight to China, how we're going to counter China's efforts in RCEP and other agreements. But at the same time, it was really important that we made the case, and we could make the case that this was in the economic interest of the United States. and that it would achieve some of the goals that are very popular right now in the United States, which includes supply chain resiliency and having secure supply chains, and in many respects, diversifying supply chains away from China. And so not only, we couldn't simply rely on these national security arguments, we also had to figure out how to make sure it made economic sense and met some of the objectives of the moment. At the same time, we also wanted to balance the need to gain domestic support for this and include U.S. priorities, while at the same time not going so far that no one else in the TPP wanted to take any of these suggestions on board. And so we've really tried to be respectful and mindful of the position of Japan and others who are currently in the agreement. The way we handle this is, we spent almost a year in these private working group sessions with these other trade experts. And we use those sessions to develop the recommendations that were in this report. But before we released it to the public, we wanted to get input from other influential folks representing different kinds of industry, the labor community, the environmental community, agriculture, services. And so we talked to a lot of folks in industry and got their opinion on our recommendations. We also talked to both former and current officials in the administration. We talked to congressional staff, and we talked to numerous other CPTP members, including Japan, and really just wanted to make sure that nothing that we recommended was a complete non-starter, and also that we didn't miss any issues that were going to be important for the United States domestically. And so that was the process we went through. And I think our view is that we have hopefully put enough substance on the table that meets a lot of the criticisms of TPP, such that we have the ability to really start this conversation domestically, while at the same time, hopefully not turning off any of our important allies in the agreement. And as you will see, as we go through these recommendations, we tried very hard to be flexible and to recognize that we wouldn't in every case require massive changes to the agreement, but some cases we would actually require changes in U.S. domestic law or in U.S. implementing the legislation to try to achieve things. Next slide, please.
So as Clete mentioned, we put forward very detailed recommendations in 12 different areas, and we'll go through them in this webinar quickly. But in putting together these recommendations, we drew from a lot of different sources. First, we did look at the 22 suspended provisions. Those are provisions that the current CPTPP members decided they weren't going to put into effect if the United States wasn't going to join. And so some of those we think would be useful to bring back into the agreement, but not all 22. I'd just like to underscore that point. Things have changed, particularly with respect to the U.S. position on some of these matters. Second, we've looked at IPEF, and although we don't know the details of what will be pursued with respect to supply chains and digital, we do understand that there'll be some new kind of added features that probably would have a home in a new TPP agreement. We also look carefully at the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement because this is an agreement that received, again, unprecedented bipartisan congressional support. And so therefore, we thought that these provisions are useful to look at, but we also recognize that just because Mexico and Canada embraced some of these provisions did not mean that our Asian trading partners would feel the same way. We also looked at bilateral agreements such as the U.S.-Japan digital agreement when we put together, for example, our digital recommendations. And we looked at agreements in the region, and frankly, where the U.S. is not a party to, including the New Zealand EU agreement, with particularly their environmental chapter. We looked at the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement and the recent agreement between Singapore and Australia on a green economy. But again, we also just kind of brainstormed and particularly looked at some of the matters that are, really on the minds of Congress and a lot of US stakeholders, including supply chains and the other kind of novel area we added to our recommendations, is the area of economic coercion, which is gaining a lot of attention and concern in the United States. Knowing my Japanese colleagues very well, I want to reassure them that when it comes to market access, including tariffs, quotas, services commitments, etc., our recommendation is that for the most part, we leave the market access commitments as is. And to the extent that the US was interested in renegotiating any specific market access commitments with respect to a certain country in the CPTPP, then we would need to be prepared to make proportional concessions. So our recommendations really focus on the rules part of CPTPP. And, again, we put aside market access, thinking that kind of the thinking, I think, when the 11 CPTPP members came together to put CPTPP together, that once you start changing the market access provisions, they can quickly unravel. So Clete, over to you. Next slide, and we'll go through these 12 areas quickly.
Great. And before I jump into the recommendation on rules of origin, I do want to pick up on the last point Wendy was making, which is that in today's presentation, we will just focus on the 12 recommended changes that we make. And we basically recommend that the vast majority of the agreement stay as it is. It is a very good agreement in many ways. And really what we're trying to do here is be very targeted on the areas where we would need to seek improvements or updates based on some of the current interests of the United States. But the vast majority of the agreement would stay as it is. Now, this first one is important to the United States, and I recognize, and I'll acknowledge this right at the outset, this could be a challenging one for Japan. And obviously, market access for autos is something that I know your industry has viewed as an important part of the agreement. But the reality is that from a political standpoint, this is probably the #1 issue in the United States that has engendered opposition to the current text. And the perception that the autos rules of origin are not strong enough, are not nearly as comprehensive as what we have in USMCA, and would allow a significant amount of content from non-market economies that are not part of the agreement. That's code for China. So this is I think, an issue that does need to be addressed. Now, what we wanted to do, though, was to try to be flexible and to recognize that we may come to a situation where there are certain countries in the agreement that are willing to have higher regional value content, higher content for the autos rules of origin. But maybe that isn't something that everyone can do. Maybe that is something that the US and Japan can't agree on. And so basically what we're suggesting here are 3 options. The first option would be that we would seek a simplified, higher regional value content for all countries in the agreement. But if that's something that we can't achieve, then the second option would be to look at trying to raise the rules of origin between the US and certain members in the agreement, so maybe the US and Australia, but that would not in any way affect Japan's rules of origin with others in the agreement. So it would really only affect the US and a specific other country with which we would do a side letter commitment, and then the existing rules would continue to apply for Japan for others. But then that brings me to the third idea, which would be for those countries with which the US cannot agree, we would simply take the automotive sector, trucks and autos, off the table. And so this is just a recognition of the political reality. We would try to upgrade the rules of origin. If that wasn't possible, we don't want that to be an impediment to never allow us to rejoin the agreement. And we would simply say for that sector, we would not have additional market access. The other idea here that's going to be important on rules of origin, and you'll notice a theme throughout a lot of these recommendations, is this idea that content from non-participants, in particular China, may get duty-free access under the agreement. And so we didn't go through and look at every other rule of origin. There are other rules of origin where less than 50% originating content is required to get duty-free treatment. So we would just create a committee under the CPTPP to review whether we need to bolster any other rules of origin beyond autos. Next slide, please. I'm going to keep going for a minute here before I turn it back to Wendy and just introduce some of the labor ideas. Labor issues are, of course, another issue that's very important from a domestic political standpoint. Both Republicans and Democrats in the United States have been prioritizing labor issues in recent years. And so it is important that we're able to establish higher level of labor standards in this agreement. But I will say the good news for this audience, I think, is unlike the first issue, this is something where I'm very confident that Japan will have no problem whatsoever, agreeing to higher standards. I think this is going to be more of a challenge with others like possibly Vietnam or Malaysia or Brunei. But be that as it may, what we have recommended here are a couple of different ideas to strengthen the labor commitments. As the audience will remember, there were sort of side agreement action plans that we had negotiated with a few of the countries, the three that I mentioned. And the idea, those never went into effect because the United States didn't enter into the agreement. So the idea would be to update those with those three countries and then make them fully enforceable. We would also indicate that for those countries, we would link the tariff phase outs under the agreement to compliance with those obligations, which was something that was very important to our labor union participants. We would also look at a couple different enhancements that we had under USMCA. There's a device under USMCA called the Rapid Response Mechanism that allows for more targeted enforcement of labor commitments on a facility basis. And we would consider whether there was some way to draw on that mechanism here. Obviously, there's a different dynamic in our relationship with some of the CPTPP participants than there is with Mexico. But nonetheless, we would want to try to see if a rapid response mechanism modified for the specific interests and needs of these countries was something that could be included. We would also, this next one's a little bit of a technical fix. There's been a problem enforcing some of the labor commitments in previous trade agreements because it's been required to show that the specific labor violations have actually affected trade. And that is a standard that has been modified in the USMCA. It makes it easier to enforce labor cases, something we would recommend here. And then finally, forced labor is an issue that has gained increasing prominence, especially when countries are thinking about China, but perhaps other places in the region as well. And so we look at whether we could strengthen commitments on forced labor. Next slide and back to Wendy.
Thanks. And the third area that we've paid a lot of attention to is the area of environment and climate, which has only become more and more important, in recent years. And while the current CPTPP text, in many ways really moved the ball forward with respect to the environment, there's a lot more that can be done and many more concepts that are out there now that need to be addressed. So you'll see a lot of sub-bullets under what we would suggest on the environment. Let me highlight a few. USMCA really strengthens CPTPP provisions in a number of areas, including provisions to address marine debris, environmental impact statements, more on fishery commitments, and harmonize energy performance standards. And we would like to see those USMCA commitments be mirrored in the CPTPP. We also suggest that we try and get rid of tariff and non-tariff barriers with respect to trade in environmental goods and services. And here, to the extent tariff cuts have already been made, maybe we could even accelerate the tariff cuts in those technologies which haven't gone to zero already. Like labor, we would like to strengthen the enforceability of the environmental provisions. We also think it's important that we look for ways to promote renewable energy, to deal with issues, including deal with issues surrounding carbon emissions, including CBAMs. And here, we don't have the answer, but we think the CPTP members need to start working on this because the EU is out front here, and CPTPP can have an important voice in this international conversation as countries are talking about how to trade trade in carbon intensive products. And finally, the issue of the circular economy is becoming more and more important. And here we think the CPTPP can take on this concept by establishing principles and best practices as a first step. So just in sum on the environment, again, more can be done. Some of what we're suggesting are binding enforceable commitments, but others are really just to kind of move the ball forward with respect to having discussions with the CPTPP countries in an effort to help shape the rules that are being considered on the international front. Oh, back to you, Clete.
Great, thank you. The next area is an area where the U.S. and Japan have worked well together, and hopefully we could carry that cooperation into the CPTPP. And really, the idea here is to try to address concerns primarily about China that have only grown in magnitude in recent years. The first would be to clarify the definition of state-owned enterprises to make sure that it is a more comprehensive definition and deals with situations where there may not be over 50% ownership of an entity, but clearly the government has the power to control it and exercise influence over it, and ensuring that that would be captured under that definition, which would further discipline a lot of the activity that is going on in China, and hopefully would create an international standard that we could use in other trade agreements to discipline China's behavior. Similarly, on excess capacity, an issue I know that both of our countries are concerned about, especially with respect to steel and aluminum. The idea would to include some sort of provisions in here for countries to work together to address these problems. We didn't get super specific on what that would be. I know this is something our countries have been talking about for a long time. So we wanted to sort of leave that up to negotiation. But the idea would be that we would want to do something jointly here to show that we condemn those kinds of practices. The next idea is derived in part from the U.S.-China Phase 1 negotiations, where the U.S. tried to make progress on the issues of technology, forced technology transfer, forced joint ventures, and the way that China uses those as a condition of market entry. And so the idea would be to borrow from some of that language there and try to create an international standard that condemns that behavior. And then finally, the last one is, really meant to be a domestic political action. There isn't a robust trade remedy chapter in TPP. We wouldn't try to create a whole new chapter, but the idea would be, as part of the political compromise in the United States of re-entering TPP, we would also look at different ideas that are floating around to strengthen some of our domestic trade remedy laws. Is this one me or you?
Go for it.
Okay, I'll go for it. I go for it. So currency manipulation is pretty straightforward. This is an issue that has been sort of a long-time concern in the United States, and in USMCA, this was for the first time made enforceable, part of the overarching agreement, and included provisions that were primarily focused on transparency, but also restating some of what's in the IMF about refraining from competitive devaluations. And so the idea would be to borrow similar language from USMCA and incorporate that into this agreement. Next slide, please.
And I would just add on currency manipulation. I understand this is probably a matter that Japan will have certain issues with. There's a long history here. But again, if you really, I think it's something that in recent years, I don't think this is actually a problem between our two countries. If you look at recent Treasury reports, with respect to investor-state dispute settlement, this is an extremely controversial issue in the United States and certain other CPTPP countries. And U.S. thinking on this has evolved since TPP was completed. And what we seek here is basically what we're saying is for the existing CPTPP countries, keep all of your ISDS provisions intact. But with respect to the United States, what we would seek is what we would call a New Zealand approach. And what New Zealand did, based on my understanding, is they concluded separate side letters with individual CPTPP countries agreeing on non-application of CPTPP. So we would look to do that with most CPTPP countries. However, for developing country CPTPP members that do not have a sophisticated domestic legal system, we would look perhaps to include ISDS, but to limit it to certain sectors or problematic types of behavior. But again, we would seek to do this on a case-by-case basis and not ask the CPTPP countries to revise the ISDS text. Next slide. Government procurement is also an area where our thinking has evolved as Buy America provisions have become more popular in the United States. And so what we would look for here is with respect to CPTPP members that are also members of the WTO government procurement agreement, including Japan, we would limit our reciprocal government procurement obligations to the WTO obligations. And for those countries that are CPTPP members, but are not WTO government procurement agreement members, we would look to negotiate some kind of tailored, satisfactory balance of coverage with them. But and this deals with coverage with respect to all the procedural improvements that were made in CPTPP with respect to making the government procurement provisions transparent and fair, and provide for objective bidding and open bidding. We would keep all of those, procedures as is in the CPTPP agreement. We need an easier name for CPTPP. Over to you, Clete. We're almost done here.
Thanks. And yeah, we can go through these last few relatively quickly and make sure we leave time for questions. Digital trade's pretty straightforward. The idea here is that this has been was negotiated years ago. There have been certain enhancements in subsequent agreements, including USMCA, but also others. So we would recommend including some of those enhancements into this agreement. One of the important ones deals with the data flow issues, localization issues. And there were some exemptions for different sectors in the TPP. We would get rid of those exemptions. We would also look at changes. There was some language on algorithms and protecting algorithms and source code like that was also a helpful enhancement. So we would look at things like that and incorporating those into TPP. At the same time, the USTR is negotiating IPAF right now. They are talking about digital inclusivity and making sure that the digital provisions also work for small and medium-sized businesses. And so we would look at drawing on some of the innovations there that our countries may agree to and incorporate them into TPP after hopefully a successful IPAF outcome. Next slide, please.
And I would just add on that, if there are innovations that are put forward in the context of Japan's chairmanship of the G7 this year, I think those are also things that could also benefit from consideration of trying to fold into CPTPP as well. And
on IP, it's similar dynamic. we would look at reinserting some of the provisions that were suspended by CPTP members. There are certain elements here that are controversial in the United States at this point. Some of the issues around, pharmaceutical patent protection, biologics. We don't take a strong position on that. We don't say it has to be in or it has to be out. I think the idea is that we should look at these afresh. We probably will want to reinsert many of them, but possibly not all of them. And so we recommend trying to figure out from that list of 18 suspended provisions, bringing in a substantial number of those back into the agreement that we agree upon with our partners. Next slide, please.
So given the importance and focus on supply chains, we think it's important that we establish a new chapter on supply chains in the CPTPP that could accomplish a number of different things, including providing procedural mechanisms for dealing with disruptions and crises, to establish fast lanes for trade of essential goods, trying to learn from the COVID experience, and also looking at limiting the scope and duration of export restrictions as well. We also think it would be useful to look at, the possibility of having discussions on developing sector or product-specific supply chains, either among all CPTPP countries or a subset. And we would want to establish a supply chain working group to really promote sustainability in supply chains, including cooperation on critical minerals and other, essential and strategic goods. Next slide is also a new innovation as well. We would like not necessarily a chapter, but some provisions on economic coercion. And here we're thinking not of actual obligations, but more of a toolbox where there would be tools that CPTP members could use on a case-by-case basis to take action against countries that are exercising economic coercion, or a group of tools to help countries that are subject to economic coercion, trying to assist them as their products are targeted by a coercive power. Next slide.
Okay, so this is the last set of recommendations, and really this is all stuff that the U.S. would do domestically, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but two concepts. The first is that politically for the United States, if China joins the agreement, there's no way that we would be able to do so. It's just a reality of the domestic situation right now. And so we would make clear in our implementing legislation that we would not support efforts by China to accede to the agreement. Hopefully that's an area where we can cooperate and you can help us at least over the next couple of years. And then the last point is that in USMCA, there was a sunset provision. We didn't think that that was realistic or desirable to actually sunset the agreement. But what the sunset provision does is it does create an incentive to review this agreement over time and look at whether there are ways to improve it. And so we would create a domestic mechanism that would require the president to submit a report to Congress talking about how the agreement could continually be approved to meet U.S. objectives. And it would give Congress the opportunity to decide whether it wanted to stay in the agreement. But I think, as everyone knows, it's something they could do anyway. The idea would just be to create a process by which the U.S. would seek improvements over time. Let's go to the next slide, and maybe we can wrap up very quickly and then jump. I know there was a couple of questions. I mean, look, the goal here really is, I think we've said, is just to try to start this conversation in the United States, try to build domestic political support, and hope that by 2025, either a second term for President Biden or a Republican president, that we've created enough momentum that we can catapult off of IPEF. Hopefully we'll have some successful early harvest in IPEF, and then we can use that to drive into CPTPP. That's what we're trying to achieve. I'm excited about some of the positive feedback we've gotten, including the Washington Post editorial board endorsing many of our ideas. And hopefully, as mentioned earlier, we can look at using different political forces in the United States, including the China Committee, to really drive this as an agenda item. Let me stop there and we can go to the questions that I know have been coming in.